Dobry wieczór. Ja Jan, ja хочу piwo. That's how I survived. That's how I survived for 2 years in Kiev in 1993 and 1994, and had two of the best years of my life as a volunteer, working for one of the first independent think tanks there, and then also later for the parliament. So I've become very passionate about Ukraine, and very passionate about Ukraine's relationship with the Western community of nations, with the Euro-Atlantic community of nations. I might add also that I have family ties that link to Ukraine. My grandfather served as an emissary, as a member of the mission in Kharkiv when Ukraine had a brief period of independence at that time. So the Brzezinskis have a special affinity for Ukraine. Though I have to admit, my grandmother was astonished. As a Polish, she had kind of the old school that spoke more Ukrainian than I spoke Polish. And as you just heard, I didn't speak too much Ukrainian. We were talking about NATO and Ukraine. And just so you know where I come from, to be very clear, when I was in Kiev working as a volunteer there, I became very animated about Ukraine's relationship with NATO and its potential to accede to NATO. And for me, it was a real historic step forward when Kuchma actively started pursuing that objective. And so it's just important for all of us to remember that aspiration just wasn't Yushchenko, it was also Kuchma. And that's why I was particularly disappointed when the current president decided to kind of pull back from that drive and kind of stick with this kind of pattern of neutrality. I think that's going to be historically looked at as short-sighted and naive, particularly regarding his policy towards Russia, which I think he's now beginning to recognize and is becoming disillusioned. But why did I think that back then, and why was and who? Not only did I think that, but I also worked with a community of Ukrainians who were thinking that this relationship with NATO was something that was worth to pursue. From an American perspective, sitting in Kiev, it became very apparent to me this was a significant country. 42 million, now 45 million people. Significant military capacity, and we saw them being exercised in the Balkans on NATO's behalf later on. Its geography and its that's all right. Its geography and its location made it pivotally important. Crimea is a geopolitical pivot point in the Black Sea. And then, of course, its long border, and more importantly, its long history with Russia. Meant that where Ukraine goes, and here I'm kind of ad-libbing from my own father, speaking of Brzezinski, where Ukraine will go will significantly affect where Russia goes and Russia's relationship with the West's relationship with Russia. As long as Ukraine's sovereignty, its independence, its orientation is ambiguous and uncertain, I think it's less likely, or it's going to be more difficult for those in Russia to move forward and press the shedding of its past imperial ambitions. It'll be more difficult. A Ukraine that's outside the Western community of nations creates a situation where it will be more difficult for Russia to evolve into a post-imperial state, into a democracy, into a state that has a constructive relationship with its neighbors and that serves as a constructive international actor. So that's kind of where I come from. I was going to have my own historical list of the evolution of NATO-Ukrainian relations. And Steve and the others have added all the details and have said it far more eloquently than I. But I would add a couple of points. One, it actually started in 1991 when Ukraine joined the North Atlantic Cooperation Council and signed on. That became the Partnership for Peace. So we're dealing with a 21-year relationship. The second thing I would point as part of that list, that history of relations, was the decision to give up its nuclear weapons. Which, my friend Lubinir, I disagree. I think it was a strategically sound move. First of all, Ukraine didn't have much control over those nuclear weapons. Two, it was risking a real confrontation with Russia at that time. Three, it would have isolated itself completely from the West. It generated huge goodwill in the West. And whether we have our complaints about how close Ukraine has become and been allowed to become with NATO, what has been achieved was facilitated in part by that decision. So it was a smart thing to do. Another thing that I would add, and I mentioned it, was Kuchma actually started the process of pressing for NATO membership, and that was important because it communicated that objective to the West. It showed commitment. Bucharest. Bucharest was important in 2008, as my colleagues mentioned. And let me read the quote, because it's a powerful quote. NATO welcomes Ukraine and Georgia's Euro-Atlantic aspirations to membership in NATO. We agree today that these countries will become members of NATO. That's a pretty powerful vision statement. The problem was it was undercut by the division that occurred in the Bucharest summit over that statement. And it was further undercut by the fact that a simple step couldn't be done, which was to grant Ukraine membership or access to NATO's membership action plan, a program to help countries prepare for NATO membership, nothing close to being a commitment to NATOship or a timetable to membership. It was a real mistake. And I think one of the lessons from Bucharest is that when you're dealing with a community of democracies like NATO, in which decisions are based on consensus, and in which the threats are a little bit more different than they were during the Cold War, perhaps a little bit less urgent, in which there's more of an array of interests at play at the NATO table, it takes more time to develop a consensus. And the Bush administration, of which I was a member of in years prior to 2008, rushed that effort. They tried to get a consensus within 3 to 4 months, consensus that probably should have taken over a year and a half to develop. So I just wanted to add that point. So after 20 years, where are we today? The title of our seminar here is Ukraine-NATO Cooperation Wants to Break Down. Well, clearly it's not quite what it was during the 1990s and the first decade when Ukraine was contributing significant military forces to NATO operations in Kosovo and in the Balkans. But it hasn't totally broken down. In Kosovo today, there are 151 Ukrainian soldiers, at least according to the NATO website that I looked at last night. In Afghanistan, there are medical personnel, Ukrainian medical personnel that are supporting the Polish PRT. They have some 22, 25 officers and NCOs serving in the ISAF headquarters. And they recently pledged instructors to help beef up the Afghan National Forces. Ukraine's committed consistently ships to Operation Active Endeavour, which is NATO's patrolling of the Mediterranean against weapons of mass destruction and terrorism. They were the first partner country to contribute to the NATO response force, and they had a NBC platoon in 2010, but today provide strategic airlift capacities. And there's ongoing engagement between NATO and Ukraine in defense sector reform, budget planning, development of deepening of civilian control over the military, budget management. Ukrainian officers attend the NATO Defense College in Rome and school at Oberammergau in Germany. And Ukraine has been and continues to be fairly actively engaged in military exercises with NATO and NATO allies. Last year, it hosted Sea Breeze 2011, a U.S.-Ukrainian naval marine exercise that I think last year involved 12 allied countries. There was the U.S., Poland, Ukraine Safe Sky exercise. And it sent units to France, to Bulgaria, to Georgia, to Germany, to Hungary, and to Romania, among others, for military exercises. And just this year, I'm sure many of these exercises are continuing, but the ones I picked up are preparations for another iteration of Sea Breeze 2012. It was the first partner country, this last April, to announce its participation in NATO's Operation Ocean Shield, which is the patrolling against pirates off the Horn of Africa. And next year, Ukrainian ship or ships will be participating in that operation. And there was NATO-Ukrainian cooperation for counterterrorism operations in preparation for the Euro Cup games. So the bottom line is that there is an ongoing relationship between NATO and Ukraine. It's pretty good. It's certainly not as robust as it was during the 90s and the first decade of this century. So why have we lost this intensity? Where has it gone? Some of my colleagues mentioned, of course, the first and most obvious, arguably perhaps also the most important, Ukrainian's own position, its own internal dynamics. It is a population, has a population that has not been overwhelmingly supportive of Ukrainian aspirations to join NATO. But I would point out, I never saw strong opposition to Kuchma or Yushchenko's efforts to bring that country into NATO. So I wonder how active the opposition is. Then, of course, there's the election of Yanukovych, his immediate turn to the east, the Black Sea Agreement that perpetuated Russian military presence in Crimea. But then I would note, we've also seen a deep disaffection between Kiev and Moscow over these last 18 months. And of course, very unhelpful has been his repressive policies towards his political opposition. That certainly doesn't generate friends and supporters in the West. Outside, and defining the elements of context in the NATO-Ukrainian relationship, there was, of course, Russian pressure. The presence of the Russian fleet is a certain amount of leverage. Russia has become increasingly assertive in its effort to kind of actively pull in Ukraine into its Russian-led regional economic and security structures. And Moscow hasn't hesitated to use economic and energy leverage towards those ends. And then, of course, lurking in the background is the Russia's invasion of Georgia in 2008, which has got to make Ukraine a little bit more wary, and certainly has, for all the wrong reasons, made the West even a little bit less eager about furthering the process of NATO enlargement. I think another contextual factor is the memories of the Bucharest summit. That was disappointing to Ukraine. Formally a nice sentence, but backed by a lot of ambiguity, if not clear hesitancy and opposition within the alliance. And the fact they couldn't get to something as simple as map has got to be something that's scalded into their memory. It makes a country a little less hesitant to pursue an ambition of joining an institution like NATO. And then instead of just blaming everybody, we should look at ourselves here in the United States. How has U.S. policy contributed to Ukrainian aspirations or Ukrainian interest in NATO membership? I keep on saying 5, 4. I start off as a 10. I was like, great. I'm at 5. I'm getting worse and worse. The U.S. policy hasn't been helpful. What have been the defining elements of the current administration's, the last 4 years of U.S. policy towards the transatlantic community? It vaguely defined reset with Russia. It defends guidance that features a geopolitical pivot to Asia and further force reductions. I'm worried that can contribute to a perception of U.S. disengagement of Europe. And, of course, there's been the virtual suspension of NATO enlargement over the last 4 years. The U.S. has not been pushing this forward. It has not been pushing, and I'm not just talking about Ukraine. I'm talking about other countries in Europe that are qualified, that should have gotten membership invitations, who should have gotten stronger signals of support. It's been in abeyance for 4 years. It looks like it's frozen. And that certainly undercuts those in Kiev who'd be willing to step forward and push for Ukrainian accession to NATO. So that's where we are. And here we are at the Chicago summit. How can we leverage the summit, at least in my point of view, to kind of reanimate the process of enlargement and generate interest in Ukraine for NATO membership? Well, first of all, the United States has to be a leader in this. It's not going to happen without U.S. leadership. And when the United States gets passive on NATO enlargement, I think it's pretty safe to say the rest of the alliance is going to be pretty passive on NATO enlargement. We should use the summit to forge a consensus in NATO, to begin forging a consensus in NATO, because it won't happen overnight, about a vision of Europe that is clearly comprehensive for all of Europe. One that clearly articulates its NATO's interest and objective to have Ukraine become a member. Not dictate that to NATO, but to say that it is our objective to encourage you, to convince you that membership in NATO is attainable and in your best interest. Indeed, isn't that what Moscow is doing from its perspective? It's playing a geopolitical game. NATO should play a geopolitical game. I was struck this morning because NATO Secretary General Rasmussen spoke before the Atlantic Council's Young Leaders Conference, and they were talking about the Balkans. And he clearly came out and said, it's his vision that all of the Balkans should be part of NATO and would be part of NATO. That struck me as interesting, because I was thinking, wow, Serbia. How does Serbia compare to NATO? I would argue Serbia is far less eager about NATO membership than Ukraine is. So if we can recruit for Serbia, why can't we go out and encourage Ukraine and encourage aspirations in Ukraine to join NATO? And what really bugs me is the EU association agreement. It doesn't bug me because I think it's wrong. In fact, for the first time, as an Atlanticist who loves NATO, has been a little bit edgy on the EU, I have to admit the EU has got it right. They initialed this year an EU association agreement with Ukraine. Now it's on ice because of Yanukovych's heavy-handed approach to his opponents, unjustified approach to his opponents. But the fact is the EU has a statement of policy written in stone that says this agreement that we're moving forward on has the objective of bringing Ukraine into the EU. And that gives me hope that we can do the same for NATO, because I can tell you it's going to be far less onerous on the Europeans to have Ukraine in NATO than it is in the EU. So, number one, get moving on a vision that clearly embraces Ukraine, includes Ukraine in a geopolitical architecture of Europe. The second is an easy one. We need to start aggressively engaging the Ukrainian people, not aggressively engaging them more proactively. And we need to do that as an alliance, not just the United States going in or Poland going in, but it ought to be also Germany and France and others. But to do that, we have to build a consensus in the alliance. And the country that's going to have to lead that effort has got to be the United States, which means going over and taking the time with the Germans, with the French, with the UK and others, and say, this is in all our best interests. It might not happen today, it might not happen tomorrow, but we want it to happen in the near to medium future. Finally, we need to kick the enlargement process back into gear. Because we can't just talk about visions and talk about open doors. It's got to be backed up by a process that's moving steadily forward. And I know we're not going to get enlargement invitations at this summit, but we might be able, out of Chicago, to get language that includes a commitment or a articulation and aspiration to have another set of invitations, perhaps to Montenegro or Georgia by the time of the next summit. And we could communicate one or two avenues for Georgia to pursue to make sure it's going to get in. So in short, in closing, I don't think it's fair to say the NATO-Ukrainian relationship has broken down. It's slowed down. It's lost a certain amount of its vision. And our imperative is to rebuild that vision. It should be our imperative to rebuild that vision. And that ought to be the objective of this administration and whatever administration appears in Washington next year. Thank you.